to talk to you about stories, more specifically about movies, and more specifically into that, superhero movies. Superhero movies are a staple of American society. Every year, we're bombarded with three or four superhero movies, not to mention Star Wars movies, movies about good versus bad. Why? Why do we have so many of these movies? Why are they so popular? When did they become popular? And more importantly, why are these stories even important? Why are stories important? And why have comic book heroes become part of the national zeitgeist? Well, I would say that stories have always been an important aspect to delivering cultural satire, comedy, drama, kind of a mirror, if you would, into what we see ourselves as, how we interact with each other, what our values are. It tells us how to behave, tells us what to do in times of stress, in times of need. Some of the greatest cultures, I would argue, have been founded on some great stories. If we go back 500 BC to the Mediterranean Sea, you'll find a culture there that had its beginnings in stories that were handed down orally from generation to generation. Stories about bravery, about military might, cleverness, deceit, ability. These are stories that are commonly attributed to the poet Homer. Two stories mainly: the Iliad, which is a story of war, and the Odyssey, which is a story about a man returning home from that war. The Iliad is a story about a whole nation going to war for a woman. One woman. You see, a boy had come and abducted a woman and took her home to his city of Troy. And it upset the king, the husband of that woman. Was it really about the girl? No. It was about his honor. So an entire nation went to war for one man's honor. In that story, you find a bevy of characters with all sorts of different distinguished characteristics. But most notably, you'll find the story of Achilles, the superhuman godlike warrior who was invincible in battle, who was defiant towards his king, and who eventually became a reluctant hero and also a martyr, someone who died on battle in spite of his own desires. Now, he had a choice to die in battle, and that was his choice, but you can see, if you read that story, he wavered. He wasn't exactly sure. But he ended up fulfilling a promise that his mom made him before he left for battle, which was that if he died in battle, he would be remembered for all ages. Following the story of the Iliad and the sacking of Troy, we have another story about Odysseus, the clever general who figured out a way to breach Troy's walls by making a horse, a gift, where he could hide all his soldiers and present it to the Trojans, and they took it in, and then from within the walls they invaded and conquered and sacked the city of Troy. And the story of the Odyssey is Odysseus' story home, and how he had to outwit, play favor, and endure till he could get home. Both of these stories involve men of great feats doing great things. And I would argue that if it were not for those stories, then when the Persians, the great Persian Empire in real world history, came knocking on the Greek individual city-states to demand tribute, that these Greek nations wouldn't have thwarted them, wouldn't have defied them. They had no chance. Numbers weren't there. Do you think that the story of the Battle of Thermopylae where King Leonidas valiantly and defiantly defeated hordes and hordes and armies of Persians until he died heroically with just 300 of his soldiers to prevent an all-out Persian invasion. Do you think he wasn't thinking about Achilles? Do you think that he wasn't thinking that maybe, perhaps, he might actually join his own hero and live through the ages? What about some years later when the Persians came back and they attacked the Athenians this time, but the Athenians outsmarted them and they lured all their ships carrying all their armies, and it was so many, it was outnumbered the Athenians, but the Athenians thought of something. See, they built into their own ships battering rams, and as soon as they lured the Persians into this bay, they just rammed all their boats until they all died. That was it. That was the end of the Persian invasion, and that's when the Greek culture became the predominant culture, and that's where Western civilization was born. Would we have all that if it weren't for Homer? No. I think that the people who grew up in that society were so ingrained with what it was to be Greek, with what it was to have honor, to die gloriously on the battlefield, to outwit your opponents, to think because of their stories. David Simon, the creator of the acclaimed HBO show The Wire, said that America is in desperate need of mythology. Why? Why do you think he would say that? I remember growing up as a kid, the stories of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox, Great Lumberjack, or John Henry, who built half the railroads and died trying to beat a steam locomotive at his job, or Johnny Appleseed. All these tall tales, folk tales that were agrarian in nature, that spoke to a society that was close to the world, close to nature, close to each other, close to the dirt, close to life and close to death. Do those people speak to us? Do we tell stories about Paul Bunyan? Do we share stories about John Henry? We don't connect with those people. Why? Well, because we're disconnected. We don't live off the land. You might even say we're aliens. So what are our mythologies? Who do we connect with? Mutants, aliens, billionaires who have nothing in common with anybody else around them, geniuses, men who are morally compromised, ambiguous people who make hard decisions and have to suffer, a lot of them, with all-out post-traumatic stress and acute psychological disorders. Superman, who was arguably the greatest superhero of all time, but had his climax back in the 50s, maybe even before that, when America saw itself as great and had every right to see itself as great. We just won the Second World War. We had also won the First World War. We had a booming economy. We had gotten out of the Great Depression. We were invincible. And then the 60s happened. Counterculture. Vietnam. But more importantly than that, I think the seeds of disillusionment were sown into the generation that was growing up underneath the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw once called it. These men who came back from World War II, who were there to serve under patriotism, who believed in their cause, watched their best friends die on D-Day in the beaches of Normandy or in Japanese prison camps, tortured. These men came back knowing that they fought the good cause, but scarred and damaged, and attempting to reassert themselves in society, having families, buying houses with 2 cars and a garage, having children that they couldn't dare connect with because God forbid they lose anybody else and suffer any more loss. So they drank, a lot of them. They worked too much. They had children that they didn't care about and didn't love. Or they did, but they couldn't show it. And so this generation that was coming up from these men who came back from war, these boys, these fatherless boys, connecting with other male role models, fake role models, but culturally significant role models like Superman and Iron Man and the Shadow, these heroes who were the embodiment of good, who faced off evil just like their fathers, who they could see their works play out in the stories, these action-filled pages, and they could love, maybe vicariously, their own fathers through these pages until they went off to their great war, which they didn't want to do because nobody believed in Vietnam and all the political unrest that was going on back then. And what happens with our zeitgeist of superheroes at that point? They become darker, moodier, disillusioned, angrier. Some of them are as bad as the villains that they fight. Like, look at Batman. Batman, in all rights, is as insane as the Joker. What separates him? He's the protagonist. The story's told from his point of view. That's really the only thing that separates him. So, here we are, 20th century, watching movies about comic books. Never in the history of Hollywood has there been so many movies about superheroes. When did this start? Well, you could argue it started back in the 70s when Richard Donner made Superman, but that didn't really propel a whole lot of superhero movies to follow suit. It took about 11 years before Batman came out in 1989, and then that was followed by a series of really unsuccessful Batman movies and some successful Marvel movies. It wasn't until 2000 X-Men came out, which was gritty and dark and realistic. And then something happened that nobody expected. Twin Towers fell. And that kind of ultra realism that America experienced watching the towers fall outweighed anything we could experience in the theaters. So movies became even darker and the storylines even murkier. Superheroes struggling more and more. Why? Why are we struggling? Maybe it's because we realize we are vulnerable. Maybe it's we realize that America might not be the greatest nation. Maybe we're starting to see that the crest of power that was washing over America 60 years ago has receded. And maybe we're flocking there to the movies to just get a whiff of it again. Or perhaps, just like the Greeks did, maybe subconsciously we're preparing for our great war. Whatever that may be. I'm certainly not a warmonger. But if and when we do have that great battle, are we going to face the opposition like King Leonidas? What do our superheroes tell us to do today? Next time you go to a movie, ask yourself, what's Captain America asking of you? What's Tony Stark saying? What's Bruce Wayne really doing? And who is Superman? Is he us?